All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today we're unpacking a seriously fascinating intersection, the place where American domestic religion collides with international geopolitics, specifically when we're talking about Iran and Israel. When we look at global events, it's so incredibly easy to view military and diplomatic decisions purely through a lens of secular strategy or economics, or maybe national security. But as we're going to see today based on the source material, relying on that lens alone means we are completely missing a massive driving force in American politics.
We're kicking things off with a massive paradox. Make it make sense, right? How exactly does a voting bloc that is deeply, intensely focused on domestic issues and explicitly wants to end foreign wars simultaneously cheer for overseas military action? It's a question that completely baffles a lot of international observers. You've got a political movement championing this inward-looking America-first isolationist philosophy, yet they are the loudest cheerleaders for specific, highly aggressive maneuvers in the Middle East.
So, to figure that out, we're going to hit 6 key areas: the U.S. religious marketplace, the foreign policy paradox itself, defining Christian Zionism, the gap between strategy and religious PR, biblical framing in action, and finally, the threats to a pluralistic democracy.
All right, let's start with Section 1, the U.S. religious marketplace. You really can't understand American foreign policy without first getting a handle on American domestic religion. Think about Europe for a second. Over there, historic state churches are mostly secularized now. They're basically treated as quiet tourist sites. But America? America operates as a fiercely competitive free market. Because the country was founded without a centralized state religion, churches have to constantly compete for attendees. To win over this highly mobilized consumer base, American megachurches offer incredible amenities. We're talking dynamic youth programs, massive rock concerts, and yes, sometimes literally a Starbucks in the lobby to caffeinate the congregation.
But we do have to ground this in the data. Despite the highly visible power of these megachurches, a rising 30% of the U.S. population is now completely secular. So, while this religious free market is powerful and it's definitely loud, it doesn't represent the entirety of the country. This 70-30 split is absolutely crucial to keep in mind. Analysts point out that when political leaders use heavy religious messaging, they aren't speaking to the whole nation. They're hyper-targeting a specific, energized demographic.
Moving right along to Section 2, the foreign policy paradox. Okay, so we've established the religious landscape. Now let's talk politics. This powerful voting base is historically inward-looking. They fiercely prioritize domestic social issues, things like family and gender dynamics, while actively demanding an end to costly foreign interventions. They've spent years campaigning against the expensive, nation-building foreign policies of past decades. They want American resources spent strictly on American soil.
Which brings us right back to our glaring contradiction. You have an isolationist base that actively cheers for specific, aggressive maneuvers in the Middle East. Why do voters who generally show very little interest in global affairs suddenly become incredibly invested the second the topic turns to Israel and Iran?
That brings us to Section 3, defining Christian Zionism. To solve our puzzle, we have to look at Christian Zionism. This is the specific theological movement acting as the bridge between domestic faith and foreign policy. By viewing geopolitical support for Israel as a spiritual mandate, international intervention is suddenly transformed into a domestic religious necessity. For believers of this worldview, backing Israel isn't about secular diplomacy. It's viewed as literally written in Scripture. They believe God will bless those who bless Israel, meaning supporting Israel and opposing adversaries like Iran is seen as the ultimate way to ensure America's own prosperity and protection.
And just to put some scale on this, within the broader American evangelical movement, an estimated 60% strongly support this Christian Zionist worldview. So we're not talking about a fringe minority here. This is a massive, incredibly well-organized, and financially powerful voting bloc that lobbies fiercely to shape Washington's decisions.
But check out this generational shift. Support is dropping significantly among Gen Z evangelicals, down to about 40%. Observers note this creates a real sense of urgency. Political leaders know they need to capitalize on this aging voting bloc right now because this well of unconditional support might look very different in a decade.
Next up, Section 4, Strategy versus Religious PR.
This gap between theology and policy is really the core reveal of our explainer today. It's a masterclass in targeted political communication. Behind closed doors, military briefings are entirely secular and strategic. We're talking military targets, economics of the Strait of Hormuz, minimizing casualties, the usual stuff. But when leaders step up to the podium to explain these actions to their base, they completely switch vocabularies. They turn complex geopolitical maneuvers into a cosmic battle of good versus evil.
And this isn't exactly a new phenomenon. It's the result of decades of strategic lobbying. You can trace it back to 1994, when figures like Ralph Reed mobilized evangelical voters, right through the Iraq War in 2003, all the way to 2018. That year, decades of intense pressure culminated in moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. Sources note that geopolitical move was heavily driven by domestic religious lobbying.
Let's see what this looks like on the ground in Section 5, Biblical Framing in Action.
Let's look at some incredibly vivid examples from the source material. These aren't just subtle hints. We're talking about overt, highly produced messaging. For example, at a White House Easter dinner, prominent evangelical leaders explicitly linked modern political figures to Queen Esther, who biblically saved the Jewish people from the Persians. So by framing Iran as the ancient Persians and the U.S. government as Queen Esther, a modern military conflict is instantly sold to the base as fulfilling ancient scripture.
We see this again with things like Operation Epic Fury. Spiritual leaders were actually invited to the White House to publicly pray over military operations. They turned secular warfare into highly shareable religious social media content. Key advisors were broadcasting prayers for military strikes directly to millions of followers on Instagram, effectively crowdsourcing spiritual support for an offensive.
It even trickled down to the Pentagon. They framed the rescue of a downed American pilot in Iran on Easter Sunday as a literal resurrection. During the press briefing, they leaned heavily into the timing of Easter, using language mirroring the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ to describe a military extraction. Critics were quick to point out how this explicitly blurred the lines of church and state.
Which naturally leads us to our final part, Section 6, Threats to Pluralistic Democracy.
So, what is the danger in all of this? Well, injecting exclusive Christian rhetoric into military briefings ignores the vast religious diversity of the U.S. Armed Forces. The military employs Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, and Hindu chaplains, yet the PR messaging constantly defaults to exclusive Christian framing. Plus, it causes serious friction on the global stage. When traditional figures like Pope Francis have criticized this violent political rhetoric, the political machine has lashed back, even attempting to label the Pope as the radical left.
Furthermore, the data reveals something pretty telling. Only about 30% of the broader American public actually supports a war with Iran. For researchers, this proves that this religious PR isn't a reflection of national will. The vast majority of the country doesn't want this conflict. This intense religious framing is simply a targeted tool to ensure a highly motivated base shows up to the ballot box.
The crucial takeaway here is the trap of religious absolutes. When you sell a secular policy using the absolute terms of good versus evil, you strip away your future ability to negotiate or de-escalate. In normal diplomacy, you can make a deal or back down for economic reasons. But if you spent months telling your voters that your geopolitical opponent is literally the embodiment of biblical evil, how do you ever sit across a negotiating table from them? You back yourself into a corner where absolute victory or total war are the only outcomes your base will accept.
As we wrap up this explainer, we really have to ask ourselves, what happens to the stability of the global order when the world's most powerful democracy is forced to run its foreign policy through a domestic religious filter? The decisions made in Washington impact literally everyone on Earth. But if those decisions are being packaged, sold, and constrained by the religious dynamics of a fiercely competitive domestic market, the path toward rational, flexible diplomacy becomes incredibly narrow. It's a huge question, and one that's undoubtedly going to shape the decades to come. Thanks for joining me today, and keep questioning the narratives behind the news.